For those of us just joining us now, welcome to this portion of our Los Ranchos Presbytery meeting. My name is Deborah Mayhew. I am moderator of the Presbytery, and we're delighted that you could be with us tonight. During a couple of housekeeping things first, someone left this in the fellowship hall during dinner. Mr. Parker, would you like this? Okay. I will bring it down for you. Okay. What's the password? Are you sure? No. Good. I'm glad we found the owner. During the presentation by Father Boyle, photography is permitted, but please no flash. We will be video recording the presentation, and we will be posting it on the Los Ranchos website in a few days. And feel free to tag at Homeboy Industries on social media. Joining Father Greg tonight, and they will be up here shortly, are homeboys Enrique and Ricardo. And they will share their stories of finding Father Greg and now how being part of Homeboy Industries has changed their lives. Father Greg's presentation will be followed by a Q&A, and if you wish to ask a question, just remain in your seat, and he will call on you, and you will be able to ask your question. And if you've brought a copy of Father Greg's books, he's available to sign them quickly after the presentation. And we can do that in the lobby out there. Father Greg is a native of Los Angeles and a Jesuit priest who, from 1986 to 1992, served as pastor of Dolores Mission Church in Boyle Heights, then the poorest Catholic parish in Los Angeles that also had the highest concentration of gang activity in the city. His work with gang members and others on the margins led to the establishment of Homeboy Industries in Los Angeles, now the largest gang intervention, rehabilitation, and reentry program in the world. Part of Homeboy Industries includes catering, homegirl catering, and we were lucky enough to enjoy their catering tonight at our Presbytery dinner. As Father Boyle says in the introduction to his book, Tattoos on the Heart, in which he shares countless profoundly moving stories of his work. Clearly, the themes that bind the stories together are the things that matter to me. As a Jesuit for 37 years and a priest for 25 years, it would not be possible for me to present these stories apart from God, Jesus, compassion, kinship, redemption, mercy, and our common call to delight in one another. If there is a fundamental challenge within these stories, it is simply to change our lurking suspicion that some lives matter less than others. William Blake wrote, "We are put on earth for a little space that we might learn to bear the beams of love." Turns out this is what we all have in common, gang member and non-gang member alike. We're just trying to learn how to bear the beams of love. We're so grateful that he and Enrique and Ricardo are here tonight, and I'd like to welcome Enrique.
Good afternoon, everybody. So I'm pretty sure everybody knows me here. So I'm going to share a little bit of my lifestyle and how I met Father Greg and how I found Homeboys. So as a little boy, when I was 14 years old, I grew up like in a dysfunctional family, you know. My mom, she really didn't pay attention to me. I felt me personally in my heart, I felt lonely. So I went and got into a gang at 14. After that, I started getting incarcerated, going to juvenile hall, camps, and of course I met G at Camp Monks. He gave me his little business card. He told me, "Son, when you get out, come visit me, and I'm going to give you a job. I'm going to help you change your life. I don't want to see you in here no more." And I said, okay. I told him okay, but I wasn't really ready, so I had got out, and I wasn't ready. I didn't end up going to Homeboys till like a year later, and even when I did walk through those doors, I wasn't ready to change my life. I just went, just thinking I was ready, but I was not ready. So it took a long time. It took a while for me to get where I'm at now. It took maybe like a good 6, 7 years going in and out through homeboys, being in and out of jail. And, I come a long way now. I'm happy where I'm at. Everything has helped me. I got my high school diploma at homeboys. But more I could say, this guy right here helped me go down the right path. And where I'm at now is just lovely, and I love where I'm at. I love homeboys. I love everybody here, everybody. Congratulations for being here, and I enjoy you guys hearing my story. I had a long, hard life, going through a lot, been through a lot. I lost my dad, So just being up here is just hard for me to be up here, but I'm here, and I'm just here to share my story and let you guys know where I come from, and that's about it.
Ricardo, welcome.
Good afternoon, everybody. I think, I've had a typical, normal life in the ghetto. And, I'm a Boyle Heights original. And it's crazy because I say that with pride, because a part of me holds a little bit of pride in that, but I'm way past that today. I remember, I'm just gonna, summarize, my story. And I remember being outside my house, and I remember being inside my house and hearing a scream, and it said Ricardo, and it was my friend Alan, and we were gonna hang out. And we were gonna have a good time, right? And I had told him, hey, you know what? I'm gonna go take a shower. Why don't you just relax, wait for me, and then we'll go. And then as I'm in the shower, I hear him say, I will be back. And then I get a phone call, and there's helicopters, and there's yellow tape everywhere. And they had told me that they had shot him. And a lot of people had gotten shot that I've been around, and but nothing ever really happened. So I'm like, oh, well, I'm gonna go see what happened. And I remember walking down to his house, and I had fit the description of somebody who was involved at the time. And I remember the cops pulling me over, telling me to lift up my shirt. I asked him what happened, and he had told me nothing, but he knew what happened. And when I got there, I couldn't cross the yellow tape, but I did anyway because that was my friend, and I loved him. And I got there, and I started asking questions, and some guy who was standing next to me, I asked him, do you know what happened? Do you know the kid that stays there? I'm like, yeah, that's my friend. He goes, they just shot him and killed him right now. And I started freaking out. And I'm like, how do you know this? Because I seen it happen. He said, I tried to do CPR on him, and he wasn't moving, he wasn't responding. And he showed me the blood in his hands from the CPR. And I went crazy. I went really crazy. I lost my mind. I didn't trust anybody. People wanted to get me. I went to jail. 3 months after that, because I went so crazy that I think God saved me at that point. And fast forward that, I remember being so used to the chaos that people were looking for me. As soon as they found out that I was out, people were looking for me, and I couldn't leave my house. I couldn't walk out the gate. And I remember walking out the gate one day, and I seen a car with like 4 people driving, and I seen them, and they looked at me, and they freaked out, and they kept going around. And I had ran around them, around the alley, jumped the fence, and ran on top of my house. I lived in a pretty little ghetto spot with 3 garages, and I lived on top of the garages. And my brother would stay in the bottom of the garage, and I just started hearing what sounded like fireworks, and it was. I remember my mom dropping to the floor, typical Mexican woman, doing all this. Oh my God! And I'm like, Mom, it's fireworks. Don't worry about it, you know. And then I hear my brother saying, oh my God, don't move, don't not move. And then I go down there and I see a pool of blood, and somebody had got shot because they thought it was me. And shortly after I went to jail, I ended up going to the penitentiary, and I knew that my life needed to change when I was in there. I knew that something needed to happen. I didn't know what needed to happen, but something needed to change. And I don't ever talk about this. I try to, you know, I try to stay reserved, and I don't tell my story to nobody because everybody has the same story at Homeboys, and I try to be as authentic as possible. But you know, I end up getting out of jail, and I end up latching onto parole because parole was like the only thing that I had at the time, and it still didn't have what I needed, and I ended up discharging parole. And I talked about this a few weeks ago, that being off parole for me was very scary. It was a very, very scary move. And how I got to Homeboys, how I got to Homeboys was, how I got to Homeboys, I ended up homeless because I didn't want to go back to crime, right? I didn't want to, go back to crime. I didn't want to go back to the neighborhood. I didn't want to go back to that life. So I ended up being homeless, and nobody would hire me. Denny's denied me, and I'll never forget that. And I remember, spending a lot of holidays and a lot of Christmases alone, and it was very depressing, and I was very hopeless. And I remember being at a meeting. It was a Narcotics Anonymous marathon meeting. Somebody took me there on Christmas Day to not be alone, and somebody shared their gratitude, and they caught my attention. And this man gave me Homeboy's number, right? I wanted to go through solar paneling. And I talked about this the other day, but I'll say it again. My dream, my life today is beyond my wildest dreams, right? But my dream at the time was to get enrolled into solar paneling, right? And find the nearest bridge closest to the school so I could pursue my dream. And nonetheless, I ended up, I just got my GED there. I did solar paneling, and I didn't have to do it under a bridge. But my life is good today. My life is good today. This is why I don't talk about this stuff, because I turn into like a Nancy and stuff, But my life is is beyond my wildest dream today. I have a beautiful little baby boy. I have a beautiful woman that I met at Homeboys, and Homeboys is it changes lives, and it teaches you how to dream. And this place is just great. Thank you.
Thank you. Ricardo just sort of glossed over the fact that he just passed his GED, just like that. So thank you, and it's the privilege of my life to I'm joined here by Ricardo and Enrique. And the day won't ever come when I have more courage, or I am more noble, or I'm closer to God than these two gentlemen. So thank you for driving here from LA. We left like 3 days ago to get here. Is today Thursday? Yeah, it was Monday afternoon. We left. I'm going to take this off. Yeah, the office at Homeboy was very cold. The air conditioning was on or something, And so every homie would come up and say, gee, Mr. Rogers called, he'd like his sweater back. So that's why I'm happy to be with you tonight. I'm good. So for 35 years, I've worked with gang members. You quoted tattoos on the heart, and I was thinking, no, those years are off. That was a long. I'm 47 years a Jesuit, and now 35 years a priest. But it's indeed a privilege for 35 years to have been walking with gang members, and so they've altered my heart and have changed the way I see things. And I remember I was having dinner with a guy named Lewis, who was a heroin addict and a gang member, and for about 10 years he helped run things at Homeboy, and he was kind of a force of nature. But he also liked to give talks, and he was greatly in demand, and people would ask for him by name, especially high schools, and he liked doing it. So we went out to dinner, and he was giving me tips on how to speak publicly, and he said, you gotta pepper your talk with self-defecating humor. I said, yeah, no shit. That is good. That is some good advice right there. So brace yourselves. So, there are a lot of things. You have your business meeting, those of you who were here earlier, but, I think what brings you here really is a kind of a longing we all connect to of wanting the world to look differently than it currently looks. And so there's a kind of vision that undergirds your presence here that doesn't have very much to do with Homeboy Industries. But you really want to see something different. So you want to foster and create and nurture a community of kinship such that God, in fact, might recognize it. And so to that end, you seek together as people of faith to imagine a circle of compassion, and then imagine nobody standing outside that circle. And so you seek together to dismantle the barriers that exclude. And so what Martin Luther King says about church could well be said of your time together this day, if you've been here all day or tonight, is that this is not the place you've come to, it's the place you go from. And you go from here to situate yourselves at the margins, because that's the only way they get erased, if we locate ourselves at them. And we stand with a certain kind of particularity. We stand with the poor and the powerless and the voiceless, and we stand with those whose dignity has been denied. And we stand with those whose burdens are more than they can bear. And every once in a while you get this exquisite privilege to be able to stand with the easily despised and the readily left out. You go from here and you get to stand with the demonized so that the demonizing will stop. And with the disposable so that the day will come when we stop throwing people away. But you go to the margins because you know that no kinship, no peace, no kinship, no justice, no kinship, no equality, no matter how singularly focused you may well be on those worthy goals, they actually can't happen unless there's some undergirding sense that we are connected. Mother Teresa diagnosed the world's ills correctly when she suggested that the problem in the world is that we've just forgotten that we belong to each other. So how do we stand against forgetting that? And you brace yourselves as you go to the margins because people will accuse you of wasting your time. But the prophet Jeremiah writes, "In this place of which you say it is a waste, there will be heard again the voice of mirth and the voice of gladness, the voices of those who sing. And other voices can only be heard if you go out to the margins. Now, I think none of that makes any sense at all unless we kind of recalibrate our notion of who God is. I'm a Jesuit, so there's, St. Ignatius always talked about the God who's always greater. That somehow we're being led to enter into this spacious, expansive, new notion of who God is. The God who loves us without measure and without regret. The God who is just simply too busy loving us to have any time to get around to anything else. And that's the God we have. There's a discrepancy, though, here. There's the God we actually have, and then there's the God we've all settled for. I had a spiritual director years ago who said, we need a better God than the one we have. He was a Jesuit. But of course he's right, because we've settled for a partial, puny, lesser God, a more realistic God. I always think one of the examples for me, and there are many, but I remember when Dylan Roof horribly killed all those worshipers at Mother Emanuel Church, and clearly mentally ill and tormented and carrying an anguish that we don't really understand. But a week later, family members of the victim stood in front of him and forgave him. Everybody remembers, you saw the images of it, and you went, oh, we're in the presence of the God we actually have. But then cut to like 9 months later, when they sentenced him to die and called it God's justice. You knew we had wandered back to the partial God, the lesser God, the more realistic God. And we have to catch ourselves on that because there is nothing more consequential in our lives than the notion of who God is. Not just God, but the notion of the God we actually have. Meister Eckhart, a mystic and theologian, says that it's a lie, any talk of God that doesn't comfort you. And we don't really believe that because we think God wants something from us. But I think the God who is always greater just wants something for us. My joy, yours, your joy complete. The homies have always kind of enlarged my mind and widened my heart. And a lot of times they do it by way of this odd way of mangling the English language that always I find very illuminating as well as charming. I remember a homegirl named Lisa, a trainee. She wanted to introduce her man to me, and he came at the end of the day and to pick her up, and she brings him into my office and she says, "This is my sufficient other." I said, "No doubt." I have a CEO now. We're kind of a large organization, $20 million in its annual operation. It's nice to have a CEO who can worry about budgets and stuff. I don't have to. And so once I had a homie come into the office and he said, "Damn, G, my lady, she is in a bad mood today." And I said, "Why?" He said, "Well, she's beginning her administration period." I said, "Well, I just finished mine, so kind of know what she's going through." But my favorite one happened when I was presiding at San Fernando Juvenile Hall, and in those days we had mass in the gym. We had like 500 gang members come, and I had my alb and my stole, and I was sitting up on kind of a little elevated place and on a folding chair, and they have these hojas, these sheets that have the readings in English and in Spanish. And so I thought, I'm going to close the sheet and I'm going to close my eyes. I'm going to listen to the homies get up and proclaim the word. So the first guy got up and did the first reading, and then the second guy got up to do the responsorial psalm. And there was kind of an overabundance of confidence in his voice, and he gets up and he says, "The Lord is exhausted." I say, "What the hell?" And it was, "The Lord is exalted." And I remember thinking at the time, wow, that's way better. That if you think about it, the exalted God really has to be a creation of our own. You know, if any one of us happened to be God, we would want to be exalted, let's be honest. And we do that. We create God in our own image. My friend Ann Lamott always says, you know you've created God in your own image when God hates the same people you do, you know. And so the exalted God, you know, but I like the exhausted God better. Viscerally, it kind of connects. You know, this God who's, oh, it's not about me, it's about you, and I only want for you, and my joy yours, and your joy complete, exhausted, generous, extensive. That is a better God than the one we have. I buried my mom, I don't know, over a year ago, I guess. And she was 92 years old, and she had 8 kids, 5 girls, 3 boys. I buried my father about 25 years ago. And you know, she died in her own home, in her own bed, surrounded by her kids, you know. And she was sharp as a tack. I mean, in the last year of her life, she had watched so much MSNBC, she was becoming Rachel Maddow. And it was funny, she was kind of not a lick afraid of dying. You know, oddly, she was just even exhilarated at the prospect of it. Like a couple weeks before she died, she said, "I've never done this before." You know? And that seemed like it was like something you might say before skydiving, and not so much your demise. In fact, the day before she died, her last words to me, and I happened to be alone with her, and she was kind of asleep, and she woke up and she saw me there, and she went, "Oh, for crying out loud," and she went back to sleep. Well, she was pissed off that she hadn't died yet, you know, and I go, "Sorry." But the next day, again, it was rare that it would just be one of us, and I was there alone, and at noon, she just kind of opened her eyes and let out this tiny, wondrous, glorious gasp. And she left us. And no one in earshot of that sound could ever be afraid of death again. But in the last weeks of her life, she would always be in and out of kind of consciousness, and we'd be there 2 or 4 or all 8 of us. And when she woke up, she'd lock on to one of us. And she'd just, with breathless delight, say, "You're here. You're here." And I remember that after I buried her, I thought, I think that may well be the only singular agenda item of our God, is to kind of look at us and say, "You're here." We always think that some other message, like, "You again?" you know, or "Can't you do anything right?" or no, it's, "You're here. Behold the one beholding you and smiling." Then you receive the tender glance, and then you don't know what to do with it except to be the tender glance of God in the world. And that's why you're here tonight, because that's what you want to be. Of that I have no doubt. And service is kind of where we start, which is not a bad place to start, but you don't want to end there, because service is the hallway that gets you to the ballroom. You want to get to the ballroom, which is the place of exquisite mutuality, where there is no us and them, where we obliterate once and for all the illusion that we are separate. Otherwise, there's the distance in service, service provider, service recipient, and you want to bridge even that. One of the great privileges of my life was knowing Cesar Chavez as a friend. He was like the best listener I've ever been in the presence of. If you were talking to him, nobody else existed. He was laser beamed focused. He was never looking over your shoulder to see if someone more important was on the approach. His whole being seemed to say, "You're here." But once famously, a reporter had commented to him and said, "Wow, these farm workers, they sure love you." And Cesar just shrugged and smiled and said, "The feeling's mutual," which of course is the goal. How do we arrive at that place where there is no daylight that separates us? I remember I was in Houston, and after a talk, I ran into a guy, former gang member, tattooed, been to prison, and he was currently at that time working as what we call a hardcore gang intervention worker. He was working in the streets with gang members. And he kind of pleaded with me. He said, "How do you reach them?" Meaning gang members. And I found myself saying to him, "Well, for starters, stop trying to reach them. Can you be reached by them?" And suddenly something gets turned on its head. There is no service provider, service recipient. It's mutual. Well, no homeboy found more job opportunities endlessly than this guy we all called Dreamer. He's doing fine now. He's in his early 40s and married, house, job, good job, kids. But in his early 20s, he was something of a yo-yo. He would always kind of be in and out of being locked up. He'd get out, and I'd find him a job in the private sector or in one of our 9 social enterprises. But then he'd always gravitate back to vague criminality, usually something involving drugs, the sale of or the use of, and then he'd wander back to me. So it was kind of a frustrating pattern that kept repeating itself. And so this one time he finished a 4-month stretch, a probation violation. He was in county jail. So he's sitting in front of my desk and he says what gang members often say, "This time, it'll be different." And I said, all right. And he was a funny kid with a dangerous sense of humor. I knew him since he was a little kid. So with him sitting there, I picked up the phone. I called a friend of mine named Gary who owned a vending machine company. And Gary had hired all these homies in the past, and I was hoping against hope maybe he'll do it again. And sure enough, he says, "You tell that guy he can start tomorrow." That's a holy man right there. So Dreamer began work the next day at the vending machine company. Well, 2 weeks later, there he is again in front of my desk. I couldn't believe my eyeballs. I said, "Híjole, Madre Santa, here we go all over again." But this time he reaches into his pocket and he pulls out his very first paycheck and he waves it proudly and he says, "Damn, gee, this paycheck makes me feel proper. I mean, my mom, she's proud of me. And my kids, they're not ashamed of me. And you know who I have to thank for this job." And I said, "Well, who?" And he looks at me strangely and he says, "Well, God, of course." I said, "Oh, sure, no, that's right. That would be God." No. You thought I was going to say you. I said, "No, gosh, God's number one." He said, "You are so lucky we're not living in them Genesis days." I'm sorry, them Genesis days? He goes, "Yeah, because God would have had struck down your ass already by now," he said, you know. Well, I guess he told me, but we just fell out of our chairs. We were just howling with laughter. And I defy you to identify exactly who's the service provider and who's the service recipient. It's mutual. So homeboy was born a long time ago when I was pastor of a very poor parish called Dolores Mission, nestled in the middle of 2 public housing projects, Pico Gardens, Aliso Village. At the time, they comprised the largest grouping of public housing west of the Mississippi. We had 8 gangs at war with each other, which was not typical to have that many, making it, according to the LAPD, the place of the highest concentration of gang activity anywhere. So I buried my first young person killed because of this sadness in 1988, and I buried my 227th about 4 months ago. Not all from that community, but I run a large gang intervention program. I get asked to do this. So the first thing we did was we started a school because we had so many middle school, junior high age gang members who had been given the boot from their home school. Nobody wanted them. So they were wreaking havoc in the middle of the day, writing on walls, selling drugs, violent. So I walked out to them and I'd kind of isolate one at a time and I'd say, hey, if I found a school that would take you, would you go? And then to my surprise, each one said, yeah, I would. And then I couldn't find a school that would take them, so that kind of forced my hand. And right across the street from the church was our parochial school, grades K to 8, occupying the first 2 floors. And then the entire 3rd floor was the convent. And so I gathered all the nuns in the living room one evening, and I sat them down, and I said, hey, would you guys mind, moving out, and we could turn the convent into a school for gang members. And they looked at each other and they said, sure. And that was the entire extent of their discernment process. And so gang members came in large numbers to the church property, not to church, but to the property, which created something of a disconnect. People in the parish would come up to me and say, wait a minute, aren't churches supposed to be hermetically sealed, good people in and bad people out, which was a good gospel challenge. And so, which reminds me that the parish at the time, they grappled with that until they came to this notion of taking seriously what Jesus took seriously and identifying that Jesus only took 4 things seriously: inclusion, nonviolence, unconditional loving kindness, and compassionate acceptance. And the parish started to embrace that, so things started to progress. And the gang members came to school and they said if only we had jobs. And the women in the parish and we marched around the factories that surrounded the projects trying to find felony-friendly employers. And that wasn't so forthcoming. So we just started things, a maintenance crew, a landscaping crew, a graffiti removal crew, a crew to build our child care center, all made up of rival enemy gang members from the 8 gangs. Then in '92 was the unrest after the Rodney King verdict, and every pocket of poverty in LA erupted, except the poorest pocket, the projects where my parish was. So the LA Times wanted to know why, so they came to me and they said, why do you think that is? And I said, well, I don't know. Maybe it's because we had 60 strategically hired rival enemy gang members who were working together every day. And they had a reason to get up in the morning and a reason not to gangbang the night before. And more to the point of your question, they had a reason not to torch their own community. So the article appeared the next day, and a movie producer named Ray Stark, who happened to have $500 million, read the article, and he summoned me to his Beverly Hills office, and he said, how should I spend my money? As I look back on it now, I can see that I woefully undershot my request, but I was young. So I said, well, there's a abandoned bakery in the, across the street from the school. It's got ovens. They don't work, but we could fix them. We could put hairnets on rival enemy gang members. They could bake bread. We could call it Homeboy Bakery. That was the extent of my business plan. And I came up with it in like 33 seconds. And he said, sure. So we were off and running. A month later, we started Homeboy Tortillas in the Grand Central Market in downtown LA. Once we had plural, we changed our name from Jobs for a Future, which we had previously called ourselves, to Homeboy Industries, as if there was any industry involved in this venture. Not everything worked. I'll be the first to admit it. Homeboy Plumbing really was not hugely successful. Who knew? People didn't want gang members in their homes. I did not see that coming. And nobody ever intends to do such a thing, but you back your way, you evolve your way into becoming, now we're the largest gang intervention, rehab, and reentry program on our planet. We never intended to do that, but 15,000 folks a year walk through our doors wanting to reimagine their lives. I suspect we were kind of job-centric when we began, or at least our first 15 years. We're in our 31st year, and now we're kind of healing-centered. The idea of being an educated inmate may or may not go back to prison, or an employed gang member may or may not, but it is our contention that a healed gang member will not ever reoffend and go back to prison, ever. It's a guarantee. So we have therapy, and we have case management and navigation and free tattoo removal. No place on the planet removes more tattoos than we do. We have a designated clinic with one paid physician assistant and like 47 volunteer doctors, 3 laser machines, 11,000 treatments a year. We have classes and all our training programs, solar panel installation training. Homeboy Bakery is thriving. Homeboy Homegirl merchandise, where we sell our logo stuff. Homeboy Diner, where Enrique works. The only place you can get food at City Hall. We have a restaurant at Terminal 4, American Airlines Terminal. Farmers markets, we have a thing called Homeboy Grocery, where we sell chips, salsas, and guacamole, and supermarket chains on both coasts. And Homeboy Recycling, where we recycle electronic waste. What am I missing? What am I missing on? Oh, quit throwing up gang signs. Cafe, that's right. Homegirl Cafe, where women with records, young ladies from rival gangs, waitresses with attitude will gladly take your order. And they cater. It's kind of a who's who. If you go there, you'll run into electeds and movie stars and Jim Carrey, Jack Black, and Forrest Whitaker, and a Vice President, Joe Biden, when he was Vice President, came with 2 hours notice. He wanted to come to the famous Homegirl Cafe. So entourage, Secret Service, selfies with Uncle Joe. I think I need to say that he was exceptionally affectionate with the homies, but they didn't seem to mind. They're smart, they know affection when they see it. And once Diane Keaton showed up, movie star, Oscar winner, Oscar for Annie Hall and the Godfather movies and stuff. So her waitress is Glenda, and Glenda's a big girl, been there, done that, tattooed, felon, parolee, gang member, had no idea who Diane Keaton was. So she was taking her order, and Diane Keaton says, well, what do you recommend? And Glenda rattled off the 3 dishes that she really likes a lot, and Diane Keaton said, well, I'll have that second one. That one sounds really good. And it's at that moment, for some reason, something dawns on Glenda. She goes, wait a minute. I feel like I know you from somewhere. You know, like maybe we've met. And Diane Keaton decides to deflect it humbly. Oh, gosh, I don't know. I suppose I've got one of those faces that people think they've seen before. And then Glenda goes, no, now I know. We were locked up together. Yeah, that just took my breath away when I heard it. I don't believe we've had any further Diane Keaton sightings now that I think of it. But suddenly kinship so quickly, Oscar-winning actress, attitudinal waitress, exactly what God had in mind. And Jesus tells us what's on his mind, that all shall be one. That's kind of what our exhausted God hopes for. And for that reason, the original covenantal relationship gets articulated this way: as I have loved you. Now, the God we've settled for, you think the finishing of that line is, love me back. No, because this exhausted God says, as I have loved you, so must you have a special preferential care and love for the widow, orphan, and the stranger. Because God thinks these are the folks who know what it's like to have been cut off. And because they have suffered in exactly this way, God thinks these are the folks who are for us trustworthy guides to lead us to the kinship of God. So we don't go to the margins to make a difference. We go to the margins so that the folks at the margins make us different. And so this talk tonight is not the place you've come to, it's going to be the place you go from. And you go from here to choose to be enlightened witnesses, people who through your kindness and tenderness and focused, attentive love return people to themselves. At Homeboy, we're kind of allergic to the notion of holding the bar up and asking folks to measure up. Mainly because our exhausted God never does this to us. Instead, we just hold the mirror up and we tell people the truth, knowing that we all share the same truth. That you are exactly what God had in mind when God made you. And then you watch folks on the margins in particular as they become that truth, as they inhabit that truth. And no bullet can pierce it, no 4 prison walls can keep it out, but death can't touch it because it's huge. But at Homeboy, we know that you have to reach in and you occasionally have to dismantle messages of shame and disgrace that get in the way, that keep people from seeing their truth. The great scripture scholar Marcus Borg used to say that the principal suffering of the poor throughout history and throughout scripture is shame and disgrace, and I think that's quite right. In the Acts of the Apostles, it has this odd singular line that says only, and awe came upon everyone. And it suggests that the measure of health in any community, including this one, may well reside in our ability to stand in awe at what the poor have to carry, rather than stand in judgment at how they carry it. So a number of years ago, I was invited to speak to 600 social workers in Richmond, Virginia, and it was one of those things they call a gang in service. So you get continuing education credits, and you're all 600 social workers are forced into a ballroom at a hotel, and so they have workshops and plenary keynote things, and so I figured I'd maybe give a keynote or maybe lunch or finish the day or something. So I said yes, and I bought my ticket. A week before I was to fly, I pull the letter out, and to my horror, I discover that I am to be the only speaker from 9 to 5 all damn day, you know. And I said to myself, as the homies would say, oh, hell no. So I called 2 homies and trainees, Andre and Jose, and we have an 18-month training program, and they were like in their 9th month. And I sit him down. I said, look, at the end of the week, you're flying with me to Richmond, Virginia. I'd like you to get up in front of 600 social workers and tell your stories. Take your time. Because we got a long-ass day to fill. Well, I'd never heard their stories, so Jose gets up first, and he is like 25 years old, and gang member, been to prison, tattooed, but he's, in his 9th month, he kind of locked on to and becoming a very valued member of our substance abuse team, a man solid in his own recovery. And now he's, helping the younger homies and homegirls with their addiction issues. So not only was he had a stretch in prison, but he had a long stretch as a homeless man and an even longer stretch as a heroin addict. And so he gets up in front of 600 social workers and he says, I guess you could say my mom and me, we didn't get along so good. I think I was 6 when she looked at me and she said, why don't you just kill yourself? You're such a burden to me. Well, 600 social workers did what you just did. They audibly gasped. And he says, it sounds way worser in Spanish. Well, I'd never seen that. We got whiplash going from gasp to laugh. And then he said, I guess I was 9 when my mom drove me down to the deepest part of Baja California. And she walks me up to an orphanage and she knocks on the door and the guy comes to the door and she says, I found this kid. And she left me there for 90 days until my grandmother could get out of her where she had dumped me, and my grandmother came and rescued me. My mom beat me every single day of my elementary school years with things you could imagine and a lot of things you couldn't. Every day, my back was bloodied and scarred. In fact, I had to wear 3 t-shirts to school each day. First t-shirt, because the blood would seep through. Second t-shirt, you could still see it. Finally, the 3rd t-shirt, you couldn't see any blood. Kids at school, they'd make fun of me. Hey, fool, it's 100 degrees. Why are you wearing 3 t-shirts? Then he stopped speaking, so overwhelmed with emotion, and he seemed to be staring at a piece of his story that only he could see. And when he could reclaim his speech, he said through his tears, I wore 3 t-shirts well into my adult years because I was ashamed of my wounds. I didn't want anybody to see them. But now I welcome my wounds. I run my fingers over my scars. My wounds are my friends. After all, how can I help heal the wounded if I don't welcome my own wounds? And awe came upon everyone. The measure of our compassion lies not in our service of those on the margins, but only in our willingness to see ourselves in kinship with them. For the truth of the matter is this: if we don't welcome our own wounds, we may well be tempted to despise the wounded. Let me end with this, and then I'm going to invite these 2 guys up. Mr. Rogers is returning because it got cold all of a sudden. Years ago, I was interviewed by a woman from the Christian Broadcasting Network, and she asked me, what do you do at Homeboy? And so I did the whole thing I told you, about tattoo removal and job training and healing and a place of resilience and where gang members can find rest from their chronic toxic stress. And then they can re-identify who they are in the world, and then they'll go out into the world, and the world will throw at them what it will. But this time they won't be toppled. And I talk about our businesses and our classes and our therapy, and I went on like that. And when I finished, she kind of made a face. Yeah, she says, but how much time each day at Homeboy do you spend, praising God? And I didn't know what to say to that, so I said, all damn day. I don't think she liked that answer very much. But it kind of begs this question, what kind of praise does our exhausted God have any interest in? And so I'll end with this story. It occurs sometimes to universities to force their students to read my books against their will. I'm not complaining, but my alma mater in Spokane, Gonzaga University, who ruined my bracket this year, as they seem to do every year, but I'm a diehard fan. So anyway, they said they had forced the incoming freshman class to read Tattoos on the Heart. So they said, we're going to have a big Tuesday night gathering, 1,000 people will be there, and will you come up? I said, sure. And they said, can you bring 2 homies with you? And I always do if somebody's going to pay for it, and I always pick homies sort of in the same way. I always try to pick among our trainees, guys who are enemies or rivals, just to force them to share a hotel room together, just to mess with them. And I always pick homies who have never flown before just for the thrill of seeing gang members panicked in the sky. Some years ago, I remember we were at LAX, and 2 older vatos and me were flying to DC for something, and one guy, dead serious, says, hey, gee, are we flying Virgin Airlines because it's our first time? I say, well, yeah, it's a requirement. We'll be coming home on American. So I picked 2 homies among our trainees, Bobby, an African-American gang member who worked at the time in the bakery, and Mario, who at the time worked in our merchandise store. And I've done this almost 1,000 times probably, but I've never picked anybody so petrified, absolutely terrified of flying than this guy, Mario. It was starting to freak me out a little bit. In fact, he was hyperventilating, and we hadn't even boarded the plane yet, So we're at Burbank Airport, as many of you have flown there. It's a tiny place, and big planes, Southwest Airlines mainly, and they don't have that hermetically sealed chute, to board the plane. They have stairs leading to the front of the plane and stairs to the back of the plane. So you have to walk out onto the tarmac like you're the president, and you climb the stairs, So I'm sitting there with Mario, and Bobby's off walking somewhere in the airport, and our plane arrives, so it's early morning, and they're deplaning. And Mario, looks at the plane. I say, that's going to be our plane. And he's, and I think, wow, he may die before we actually climb those stairs. And so then I see our flight crew arrives, pilots, and there were 2 flight attendants, females, and they both had very large cups of Starbucks coffee, and they were schlepping up the front stairs. And Mario says, when are we going to board the plane? I said, as soon as they sober up the pilots. There they go now. Perhaps I shouldn't have said that. So I should tell you that in our 31-year history, There's nobody who's ever worked there who is more tattooed than Mario. So he's all sleeved out, neck blackened with the name of his gang, head shaved, covered in tattoos, forehead, cheeks, chin, eyelids that say "the end," so that, when he's lying in his coffin, there will be no doubt for anybody. And so I'd never been in public with him, so I'm walking him through the airport trying to calm him down, and people are like this, and mothers are clutching their kids a little more closely. And I'm thinking, wow, isn't that interesting? Because if you were to go tomorrow to Homeboy and walk up to anybody there and say, who's the kindest, most gentle soul who works here? They won't say me. They'll think for a half a second, they'll say, yeah, Mario. He works in our cafe currently. Mario is proof that only the soul that ventilates the world with tenderness has any chance of changing the world. So we get to Gonzaga, and this happens always at universities. They tell you, here's the big talk Tuesday night. What they don't tell you is they've planned 93 other talks leading up to that big talk. So we, had this class, this meeting, this lunch, this class, all damn day. I just went to Seattle U. They did the same thing. So I told these two guys, I'm not going to talk at any of them. I'm going to, sit in the back of the classroom. You guys get up and tell your stories. And they were reluctant and nervous, and especially Mario was terrified, but they did a good job. They still told stories of terror and torture and violence and abuse. And honest to God, if their stories had been flames, you'd have to keep your distance. Otherwise, you'd get scorched. I would not have survived a single day of either of their childhoods. So the nighttime talk comes, and much like Enrique and Ricardo, they got up in front of 1,000 people and were quite nervous, especially Mario. Then I did my thing. And then as I'm about to finish, I invited these two guys to stand on either side of me, and it was like, yeah, ma'am, go ahead. And first question, she says, yeah, I got a question. It's for Mario. First question out the gates for Mario. Well, Mario is this tall, skinny drink of water, and he was just terrified. He clutched the microphone. Yes. And he's just terrified. And she says, well, you say you're a father, and you have a son and a daughter. They're about to enter their teenage years. What wisdom do you impart to them? What advice do you give them? And Mario closes his eyes and he clutches the microphone even more intently, and I can sense that he's starting to tremble, and he's getting a friggin' hernia trying to come up with whatever the hell he's going to say, when suddenly he blurts out, As soon as he says those two words, he rushes back to his microphone clutching, closed-eyed refuge. And now I know he's losing the battle with his tears, but he wants to get the whole sentence out. I just don't want my kids to turn out to be like me. There's silence until the woman who asked the question stands, and now it's her turn to cry. Why wouldn't you want your kids to turn out to be like you? You are loving, you are kind, you are gentle, you are wise. I hope your kids turn out to be like you. And 1,000 total perfect strangers stand, and they will not stop clapping, and all Mario can do is hold his face in his hands, so overwhelmed that this room full of strangers had returned him to himself. And in the process, they were returned to themselves, which shouldn't surprise us because it's mutual. And I think that's the only praise our exhausted God has any interest in. This talk is not the place you've come to, it's the place you go from. And we go from here to be anchored at the margins, not to make a difference, but so that the widow, orphan, and the stranger make us different. So that we can look people in the eyes and say, you're here. And the soul feels its worth. And indeed, it is a lie, any talk of God that doesn't comfort us. And pretty soon you cease to care whether anyone accuses you of wasting your time at the margins. For in this place of which you say it is a waste, there will be heard again the voice of mirth and the voice of gladness, the voices of those who sing. Thank you very much. Stand over on this other side. You okay? Thank you, Don. Yeah. It's hard to stand up here. Thank you very much. So we're just going to, I promise I'm the strictest person on time, and you just go like this, and I'll repeat the question, and then one of the three of us will make an attempt. Anything at all, about anything at all. Or not. Yes. So the question is about God and somehow feeling called and moved to maybe go to Homeboy or to turn things all around or to redirect your life. Ricardo, why don't you go first? Microphone.
In the microphone? Yeah. I mean, I really don't know how to answer that question. All I can say is that it was definitely him, and you know, that's all I can really say. You know, I don't think that I had no epiphany. It's just that you just know when it's him.
Say something.
So, about that question, I don't think God changed me. I changed myself because I wanted to change in my life. So that's how I became here at Homeboys and proceeding with my future. So I want to have a family and, you know, proceed with my future. I don't want to be on the same stuff I was doing years ago. I'm getting older, so I'm realizing. So at the end of the day, I don't know, it just comes from the heart, you know? Some people, God, but me from the heart. If you want change, you'll get it, and you'll go chase for it.
Yeah.
I wanted to say something. I know Boyle Heights area, but I like the way you say vapos, and you can communicate because you understand them. And that's gang, or I should say slang, Mexican slang.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. She's saying I've become a gang member. Yes, ma'am. Yeah. Yes, ma'am. Yeah, so the question is about prevention, basically, and we say that we're a gang intervention rehab and reentry program, and so, but we don't say, you know, our mission is to solve the gang problem. You know, we're a specific thing. So just as a drug rehab would be about trying to help folks who regrettably have gotten into gangs, into drugs, but it wouldn't be a drug prevention program because this is all hands on deck, so we don't ever intend to solve a problem in its entirety, because it requires the entire community to be about those three essential things: prevention, intervention, and reentry, or enforcement in there too, maybe four things. So we decidedly do something. But in the old days, they used to say, well, wouldn't it make more sense to kind of just hunker down and try to prevent kids from joining gangs, and essentially writing off these guys. But I'd always say, if we did that, we would in fact be undercutting our best efforts at prevention, because these guys will always have more influence on the kids coming up. So if you're not simultaneously working with them, you're sabotaging your prevention efforts. But people say, why don't you do prevention? Well, we do prevention because gang members come to our place and they find the place as something of a sanctuary where they can find rest and they can rebuild. And then they become the sanctuary that they sought. Then they go home and provide and present the sanctuary to their kids, and suddenly, for the first time, you've broken a cycle. So that's kind of how it works. But it's more, the healthier the city, the more stakeholders, the more hands on deck. I go to a lot of cities, I speak a lot of places, and people will, if it's narrow and rarefied and specially trained troops or something, and step aside, let us handle this is a tough job. If it's over dramatic, somebody's got to go in there and do it. It might as well be us. We may not come back, It's that kind of ethos. That's an unhealthy city. But if it's all hands on deck, everybody, if you're the proud owner of a Pulse, then you can be a beneficial presence, So that's the idea. So you want everybody to be involved in this. So if the profiles of kids who join gangs are the despondent kid, the traumatized kid, and the mentally ill kid, and they're on a continuum of severity, some more mentally ill than despondent and that kind of thing, then what do? You infuse hope to kids for whom hope is foreign. You help heal the damaged, and you provide mental health services. And everybody can do that. Yeah, Hank.
Is the Catholic Church embraced your mission, and they sought the wider church to try to emulate it, duplicate it?
Well, if by the church you mean the people of God, absolutely, But, the institutional church will always be lagging behind the people of God, so they'll catch up. But maybe. But I also, so we don't really have that kind of support, but people help us, so we have to raise $10 million a year, which is a heavy lift. And we've decided not to franchise and become the McDonald's of gang intervention programs, over 5 billion gang members served, because we didn't want to do that. We wanted to respect people's, autonomy and the grassroots nature of things. So we don't airlift Homeboy Industries into Wichita, for example, but we helped Wichita design their own. So we offer technical assistance. So now we have over 147 programs in the United States modeled on Homeboy, and 16 outside the country. So we gather every August. We're about getting ready for our 6th, what we call gathering. And over 300, 400 people come from all over the world who are what we call our partners. So you have Braveheart Industries in Glasgow, and Rise Up Industries in San Diego, and all these different places. And they all have their own, but they can say on their letterhead or fundraising, a member or a partner of the global Homeboy network. Yes, ma'am. The question is about police department. Yeah, it's changed so much in 31 years of our existence. They were hostile, certainly for the first half of our life. And Because, you know, the demonizing was so broad and wholesale that it was a short hop to demonize Homeboy Industries and me for helping gang members. So we'll never return to that. There's been kind of a paradigm shift, you know. It's certainly all the brass and the higher ups, you know, love Homeboy and they get it. But, you know, sometimes the rank and file, not so much. Although, were you telling me about the cops stopped you? No? And you had a hat? Somebody was telling me they had a Homeboy hat. And, oh, I know what it was. It was flappers, you know, flappers with the ears. And he came in, he said, "You'd be proud of me." And I said, "Really, why?" The cops stopped me. And they said, "Where are you from?" Which is provocative. Gang members say that to each other very provocatively. "What gang are you from?" "Where are you from?" And he said, "I'm from Homeboy Industries." This, you know, Flappers, Jesus, who works in the bakery. So he came in to tell me that this afternoon. So I thought it was you, but he was, and he was so proud of himself, you know. And the cop said, "That's right." That never would have happened. You know, in the old days, homies would take their shirts off. They'd change their shirts before they left the office, you know, because cops would mess with them. That's how things have changed, you know. Yes, sir.
Me, Homeboys. The biggest part of it brings my happiness, my joy. I don't really have too much family. I lost my dad recently, so I'm kind of like on my own, me and my girl. So I just think about my future, basically, and just want to have babies and a family eventually. But right now I don't have kids. But yeah, that's where my happiness is. This is like my home, my second home right here. I come here and I feel like embraced, motivated when I come to Homeboys.
I think it's my son. He's 2, so he's like my life, and so he makes me really happy every time I see him. And although he irritates me when he keeps on saying "daddy, daddy, daddy," he is without a doubt like what makes me happy. Yeah. Thank you.
Yes. Yeah, we didn't really, how did we bring the leaders of the 8 gangs? Well, you know, in the old days, I kind of did a shuttle diplomacy and peace treaties and ceasefires. And I don't regret that I did that, but I'd never do it again because I could see now it serves the cohesion of the gang. It sort of supplied oxygen. So I never really dealt with leaders. I didn't really care after a while about leaders. You know, Homeboy was kind of an exit ramp off this crazy freeway. And prior to that, there was no exit ramp. There was really no way off. And what that did was it compounded the despair and increased the violence. So I don't really deal with leaders because I don't believe in gang leaders. It's here we are, come when you're ready. As Ricardo was saying when we were earlier, he was saying, you know, you just have to be ready. You know, we don't recruit people. You know, like if you ran an alcohol rehab center, you wouldn't send people out every night, you know, like at 8 o'clock at night and to bars, you know, to sidle up to people and say, God, you know, I couldn't help notice that was your 8th beer, you know. Well, whatever it made you laugh at that was how preposterous the notion that is. And it's the same as with gang members. But people do it, cities do it. Again, I think it's another sign of unhealth. Because no amount of me wanting them to have a life was ever going to be the same as them wanting to have one. And so I always say, ours is a God who waits. Who are we not to? So you wait for people. When they come, you want it to be tender and ticker tape parade and red carpet. Maybe one more question. We have to get home before. Yes, Deborah. So more, is there more that I would want to achieve at Homeboy? And, it's funny, I don't do achievement, I don't do success, I don't do failure, I don't do accomplishment or disappointment. I don't do any of those things. It's cleaner not to. I have a light grasp on it. A reporter the other day, was saying, please tell me a success story. I go, no, because I don't even know what that means, really. Everybody has Buddha nature. Everybody has unshakable goodness. Yeah, the Buddhists always begin often with writings that say, "O nobly born, remember who you really are." So it's not about success or failure. And Mother Teresa says, we're not called to be successful, we're called to be faithful. So you want to stay faithful. You want to be anchored in the thing that replenishes you, which is to have it be about the other. The tricky thing about, go to the margins to make a difference is, well, then it's about you if you're going to the margins to make a difference. But if you go to the margins so folks make you different, oh my gosh, it's eternally replenishing. So I'll just end with one story. There was a kid named Danny who I knew when he was 13, and he was a knucklehead and always had a gun, and I knew him riding on his bike in the projects, and he vowed to me that he would never step foot in Homeboy Industries, He was too down and dedicated, so I knew him on the streets only. I knew him at juvenile hall, probation camp. He went to youth authority, and finally he went to prison at 18. Just for 2 years. And in gang recovery, they say it takes what it takes, like all recovery. The death of a friend, the birth of a son, a long stretch in prison. For Danny, he got out of prison, and his mother, he discovered, had 6 months to live. She had pancreatic cancer. So I watched him in a very large family, but he was the dedicated, designated hospice caregiver. And he was so tender with her, all the more remarkable because this woman really tortured him. So she died. A week later, I buried her. And a week after that, he walks into Homeboy for the very first time. And I watch him work side by side and laugh with guys I know he used to shoot at. And then he got his GED and went on to take a class at ELAC, East LA College. And so one day he came into my office and he says, what happened to me yesterday has never happened to me in my life. And he tells me that he's on the Gold Line, which is right, Chinatown stops across from us. And he's heading east to go home. And it's a packed train, but he got a seat. And standing right in front of him, hanging onto the pole, he says, is a medio pedo guy, which means he's a little bit drunk. He's a homie because he can see tattoos on his hand. He doesn't know who he is. He's an older guy. And Danny is wearing a sweatshirt that fills his chest that says, Jobs Not Jails, Homeboy Industries. And the guy who's a little bit drunk hanging onto the pole, he sees the shirt and he goes, hey, you work there? And Danny doesn't know whether to engage him, but he kind of shrugs, yeah. Is it any good? And Danny says, well, it's helped me. In fact, I don't think I'm going to go back to prison because of this place. So he tells me he stands up and he fishes out a piece of paper and then a pen, and he starts to write the address of Homeboy Industries for this guy. And as he's telling me the story, he says, I couldn't believe I knew the address by heart. So he writes the address and he hands it to the guy and he says, you come see us. We'll help you. And the guy studies the piece of paper and he says, thank you. And the train stops and the guy gets off and Danny sits. Now he returns in the telling of the story to the earlier refrain. What happened to me next has never happened to me in my life. Everyone on the train was staring at me. Everyone on the train was nodding at me. Everyone on the train was smiling at me. And now he can barely speak. And for the first time in my life, I felt admired. And I remember the two of us, we just wept because I don't know what you're supposed to do. But I think we felt sort of mutually reached. And that's what we're called to do. Thank you all very much.